What's up everyone, I'm Jeff with Modders Inc., and today I'm taking a look at the GamerStorm Baronkase Liquid by DeepCool. It's an interesting case with some unique tricks up its sleeves. First and foremost, the Baronkase supports both MicroATX and Full ATX boards thanks to two different power supply mounting options, but we'll get to that in just a little bit. The big selling point for this case are definitely looks, versatility, and the included 120mm DeepCool all-in-one liquid cooler. The cooler comes pre-installed in the system and features a flow indicator with Rgb lighting as well as a matching 120mm RGB fan. Supported are all modern socket mounts with the exclusion of TR4. This includes Intel 1150 mounts and 2011 base mounts, as well as AM2, AM3, and AM4 from Team Red. I'm a bit confused on the inclusion of the rear fan as it's black, non-RGB, and uses a 3-pin or molex connector. It feels a bit out of place given the fan on the AIO and the RGB-PWM flavor in this case. The rest of the case's features are two each of 2.5 and 3.5 inch drive bays, support for full-length graphics cards, two 120mm fan mounts on the bottom of the case with one around the rear, and a 120 or 140mm option on the front. Top and bottom have magnetic fan filters for easy cleaning. On the backside of the motherboard tray, we find rubber grommets with built-in Velcro ties for cable management, USB 3.0 and audio ports on the front, along with your typical power and reset buttons. Now I will say most case reviews are often a little tedious and can be boring for the reviewer, as to review one properly it's not really about reading the spec list that I just read you to the camera, and I'll usually try to put the system together so I know exactly what I'm dealing with, and for this particular review, I'm really glad that I did. On paper, the Baronkase Liquid ticks nearly every single feature box. Good construction, tempered glass, decent cable management, but how well do they pan out in reality? Aesthetically, GamerStorm was aiming for a modern minimalist look. The case is very clean, using sharp lines and alternating triangle patterns for most of the grille design inside and out. The black finish looks great, but it's closer to a gunmetal than a true black. While the minimalism makes sense and honestly looks great, I'm not a fan of the front handle. It looks like they took the spoiler off a Mitsubishi Lancer, and just like the car, it doesn't flow well with the rest of the design for me. The Baronkase Liquid also sports a tempered glass side panel with a slight smoke to it, along with a black dotted design around the edge, and uses the very common 4 thumbscrew design to stay closed. It's not my favorite design, as it's nearly impossible to close the glass panel without smudging the glass, and you're going to want to keep it looking very crisp and clean to make this case actually pop. One of the big tricks to this case is the ability to mount the power supply both in the bottom and in the front of this case, depending on what your needs are. In a MicroATX system, it goes on the bottom, which means out comes the included backplate and extension cord, and the power supply slips right in the basement, just as you'd expect. Now for installing the motherboard. Okay, first problem. The DeepCool AIO is not removable from this case. The tubing and the flow indicator are zip tied in the case, and the dividing wall is so close makes getting the board a bit of a challenge. In fact, I had to remove the extended GPU door because the screw head was preventing me from getting any further. Moving on, let's get the power supply connected in here. The 8-pin EPS slips conveniently through an opening in the top, and the 24-pin can slip right through the grommet. Okay, second problem. The motherboard actually covers up those rubber grommets. Not that the 24-pin lead would have fit through the opening without some encouragement anyway. And those Velcro ties, while looking nice, they don't actually have much clearance from the back panel, and I'm not sure you could comfortably close the case if you had routed the 24-pin cable through those grommets anyway. Okay, so now that we have power, let's get the pump and fan wired in. I usually appreciate having a little extra cabling, but for a system with the cooler built specifically for the case it's in, I would have liked to see some custom length cabling here. I don't need 4 feet of RGB cables to travel 6 inches between parts. One thing I was disappointed with was the excessive wasted space in the front of the case in this configuration. It feels like additional drive bays or other features could have been added to the feature set, and there's really not a lot going on for this case up front. So, MicroATX, tight, a little inconvenient, but not undoable, and it looks pretty solid when it's all done. But, as I mentioned, the Baronkase allows for both micro and full ATX board installation. The first step in this process is to mount the power supply in the front of the case with the included bracket. All that wasted space I mentioned up front, that's where this power supply is actually housed to make room for the larger motherboard. The power supply mounting bracket reveals a minor design flaw, which if you've been paying attention is kind of a theme with this review. The extension cord covers one of the screw holes, and there's really no way around it. I wound up just holding the power supply in with 3 screws. Not a huge deal, but it was certainly an over-design in the design process. To install the power supply, just remove the front spoiler and magnetic dust filter. It's a bit of a squeeze getting the power supply past the AIO tubing and front I/O cables. Once there, just screw it in with the 4 screws from the top of the power supply. Well, it seems like the screws meant to mount the bracket push up on the dust cover. I guess I'll just use the lower profile screws intended for the hard drives. It's the same threading after all. Again, this feels like a detail that should have been caught before now. Okay, so let's get the motherboard installed. Just like the MicroATX build, you'll likely want to remove the dividing wall to get enough clearance from that screw head. Connect your 24-pin power supply cables through the through the dividing wall and hide the cable in the wasted space up front. Installing the AIO is fairly trivial, and Baronkase includes brackets for every CPU socket by Intel and AMD for about the past decade, again with the exception of Threadripper. The tubing hangs a bit low once installed, so if your GPU sits in the top expansion slot, you might wind up with the tubing resting on top of it. Speaking of the GPU, it installs exactly like you would expect. Simply slide it in the side, remove the dividing wall panel, put the back end of the GPU into that wasted space up front, slide your graphics card into the PCI slot, and screw it in. Simple. Since that dividing wall sits directly on the right edge of the motherboard tray, you only have room for a 9.5-inch GPU. That may have been fine a few years ago, but cards are getting longer and longer these days. Even my 1050 Ti required me to remove the panel and stick the end of my GPU into that aforementioned wasted space. I guess the front of this case is just for the overflow of parts that they didn't leave enough room for. I'm only using one 2.5-inch SSD in this build, and that actually turns out to be a good thing. As there's only 2 mounts for SSDs, one under the glass panel and another behind the motherboard tray, you'll likely need to run 2 separate power leads from your power supply, and they're too far apart to reach within a single cable. This kind of thing can add to clutter, or you can just hide it in the usual place. Once the system is together and properly cable managed, this case actually is rather stunning, and that goes for either the MicroATX or Full ATX configurations, although the Full ATX feels like there's a good amount of wasted space on the bottom with no power supply installed there. So sure, this case has some quirks and some frustrating omissions when you're building, but let's just turn it on and admire that RGB goodness. That is, of course, unless I didn't flip the power supply switch to on, and now I have to disassemble the front half of the case in order to turn this thing on. That's better, and really is a good-looking system. Aside from the system build difficulties, there's one more thing that I feel I need to mention. Quality control. This case was shipped to me with 2 of the screw posts under the glass panel cross-threaded. One of the posts actually broke loose and began spinning, making it nearly impossible for me to even get into and review this case. I managed to get the screw out eventually, but the top post will either need to be retapped or repaired somehow. Secondly, the RGB lighting on the pump seems to have a dead channel, as the red is not lighting up with the rest of the kit. Not the biggest deal in the world, but it's, again, something worth mentioning. So how do I wrap this up? The GamerStorm Baronkase Liquid by DeepCool is a bit of an interesting design, and I'm torn on recommending this, as I'm not sure who it's designed for. Is this an enthusiast case? It is made of good thick steel, making it very sturdy. It supports full-size motherboards and graphics cards, and has lots of options for fans. But it only includes a 120mm AIO when a 240mm could have easily fit. Sure, at stock speeds my 5820K was humming along at 55 Celsius, but with a moderate overclock to 4.4, this couldn't keep it under 85. The case also limits your ATX motherboards to only 5 expansion slots, making multi-GPU builds nearly impossible. Is this case for beginners? It includes the AIO pre-installed with an easy guide on how to mount it to your board, taking care of your cooling and RGB lighting for you. But why is it $140? In the end, I think this case looks great. But for me, as a system builder, there's just one too many headaches and design flaws to make this a real clear winner. But what do you guys think? Is the Baronkase worth it in the end, despite all these sweat, tears, and swearing? Let me know down in the comments below. Make sure to like the video and subscribe so you don't miss any future reviews or possible modding projects. Also be sure to check out the Modders Inc. Amazon store, links in the video description below. Thank you everyone for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.